Prequels are always a tricky thing to get right, even if on the surface it seems like it should be easy. At face value, it should be simple. Tell the audience the story of the events that happened before an already existing story. Usually prequels are used to fill in the gaps and explore more of the world and its characters, while at the same time building to and setting up everything the audience is already familiar with.
And yet despite this, it seems like prequels disappoint more often than not. Most likely because they are too focused on bridging the gap than telling a compelling story of their own. But there are exceptions to this fact, and I think one of the best current examples of a prequel done right is none other than Better Call Saul. A prequel to the critically acclaimed and beloved Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul chronicles the journey of lovable con artist Jimmy McGill, as he makes the choices that will ultimately transform him into the slippery and charismatic attorney Saul Goodman, played brilliantly by Bob Odenkirk.
I remember when news first broke that Breaking Bad was going to get a prequel. I and many others who held that series in high regard were initially a bit worried, fearing that the series would be just another cash grab by the network, coming off of the surge in popularity Breaking Bad experienced in its final season. But the first season of Better Call Saul, which displayed the same amazing writing, acting, and precise filmmaking that made Breaking Bad so great, proved to be just as compelling as its predecessor. And from there, it has only gotten better. And now 3 seasons in, it is extremely apparent that the show is a worthwhile series in its own right, avoiding the pitfalls that plague so many other prequels while also existing as its own story.
So why is Better Call Saul a success when so many other prequels fail? To better understand this, we've decided to take a look at Better Call Saul and compare what it does right to what other popular and well-known prequels of the past did wrong. Doing so should better illuminate just what makes Better Call Saul the pinnacle of what a prequel should be, and thus why it should set the standard for what other prequels should aspire to be relative to their original works.
One of the explicit purposes of a prequel is to enhance an audience's understanding of the original work by providing greater context to past events. But with any prequel, no matter how well intentioned, there is always the risk of doing the opposite, of detracting from the original source instead of enhancing it. This is precisely the case with director Ridley Scott's Alien prequels, Prometheus and Alien Covenant. Both exist to provide answers to the longest running questions of the Alien franchise, namely the origins of the deadly xenomorph and how that relates to the mysterious dead pilot found in the derelict in the original Alien. Fans have wanted to know for decades, and thus were excited when Ridley Scott announced his intentions to go back to the world he helped create.
But with both Prometheus and Covenant, Scott's ambitions went on to undercut the very premise that made the Alien movies such white-knuckle thrillers. The space jockeys, once large and disturbing biomechanical beings, were turned into pale humanoid gods wearing suits, while the alien was made to be the result of genetic experimentation via David the android.
Truth be told, these are decent ideas in their own right, but both of these answers lack satisfaction not just because they necessarily go against audience expectations, but because they contradict the themes of the originals and detract from their horrific elements. The Alien movies, along with the titular creature, are supposed to be frightening, but in providing answers in the way that Scott did, it takes all that away. Thus the entire point of the Alien, that Lovecraftian fear of the unknowable vastness of space, is now gone. The universe becomes smaller, the alien loses its mystique, and fans are left wondering whether they actually ever wanted the alien to be explained.
Better Call Saul, on the other hand, is a prequel that knows how to make you love and appreciate the original all the more, because instead of contradicting it, it enhances and complements it. Better Call Saul sticks with the core style and themes that made Breaking Bad so good. The intricate framing, the attention to detail, its focus on character metamorphosis, and the nature of choice. All of these were integral to the dramatic foundation of Breaking Bad and are ever present in its prequel.
Better Call Saul then expands on this by balancing the old with the new and the familiar with the unfamiliar, in an organic way that lets the story develop on its own terms without forgetting its ultimate purpose, to explore change. From this idea comes the need to flesh out and provide context for characters that could be considered only two-dimensional in Breaking Bad. Now that they are brought to the forefront, their choices in Breaking Bad are given more emotional weight. Mike isn't just some extremely intelligent criminal, he is a far more relatable character as he attempts to keep his family afloat and right his wrong. wrongs. Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad can now not just be seen as a functionary comedic relief character, but as a tragic character, as his perpetual fall from grace as he struggles with himself and those around him presents him with relatable motivations. We discover that the Saul Goodman we see in Better Call Saul is not this unlikable leech on society, but a charmingly flawed person struggling to find himself and integrate with the rest of society.
So then, Better Call Saul doesn't undermine or attempt to retcon the relationships and character decisions depicted in Breaking Bad. Instead, it provides greater context for the Saul we see in Breaking Bad and how he became that person.
Yep, and in contrast, prequels like Prometheus and Covenant forget themselves and go so far off on their own that they forget to preserve the spirit of the original. Better Call Saul honors what came before it by exploring similar themes while enhancing certain characters by shedding new light on them.
Another aspect of Better Call Saul that really works is that it builds, maintains, and recontextualizes the thematic framework presented in Breaking Bad. Both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul are explorations of change, or rather how a person can change and evolve given their own internal desires mixed with external pressures. Breaking Bad showcases this change of identity from Walter White to Heisenberg, while Better Call Saul depicts this change through Jimmy McGill into Saul Goodman.
Both series deal with this main idea, but in altered ways as they focus on different characters, and thus the context of how each gives in their own inner desires differs. Walter White's drive to become awake was due to his own internalized victimhood as a man who has never crept out of his own shadow to see what's on the other side, while Jimmy McGill's innocence is slowly destroyed by the external expectations placed upon him by his closest allies, Chuck and Kim. He attempts to be Jimmy McGill, the lawyer, but ultimately through betrayal and love, his old habits are too hard to shake. Both shows are character studies that explore complex moral questions, but the nature of these characters are fundamentally different, and so moral ambiguity and the pursuit of oneself is explored in two different ways. Better Call Saul is not merely repeating Breaking Bad's subject matter, it is effectively adding to it.
On the other hand, Hannibal Rising can be used as a counterexample in this regard. Unlike Silence of the Lambs, which explores the psychology of violence through the anomaly of Hannibal Lecter, a juxtaposition between charming intelligence and horrific acts of cruelty and violence, Hannibal Rising falls into the trap of normalizing Hannibal Lecter. The tale of his origin story presents no real insight into the mystique that is Lecter and the grander implications of the psychology of violence. Instead, Lecter is confined to a number of action/horror cliches of a revenge persuasion. Hannibal Rising essentially forgoes any real advancement in terms of the thematic and character material in favor of reducing Hannibal to nothing more than a troubled person with psychological trauma. In other words, he becomes known to the audience, losing everything that made him that anomaly. What actually makes Hannibal such an engaging villain is that unlike other villainous characters, Hannibal Lecter's antagonistic nature can't be explained away by fallacies such as trauma or just sheer insanity. That is what makes him such an effective proposition, because his villainy isn't at first apparent. It's hidden behind a guise. He is an unknown. And much like the case of the original Alien film, there's nothing the audience fears more than the unknown. Hannibal Rising and Better Call Saul couldn't be further apart. Where Hannibal Rising is a gross miscalculation that fails to shed new light on its titular character, Better Call Saul complements, advances, and improves what has come before.
I also think one of the greatest temptations when crafting a prequel, especially to a beloved franchise, is to shoehorn in moments of fan service and callbacks to the previous material in a misguided attempt to win points with the fans. While there's no shortage of prequels that engage in this habit, no other series has done so brazenly as the Star Wars prequels. While you can certainly credit writer-director George Lucas for attempting to do so many new and different things with the prequels, some of which weren't exactly well received, this is undermined by the fact that they are filled to the brim with references and characters from the original trilogy. A particularly egregious example of this is how C-3PO and R2-D2 are both pointlessly forced into participating in the prequels.
While instances of fan service such as this are sure to delight fans, that feeling of delight is only temporary. And the more you think about it, the more you realize how detrimental it is to the story. In this case, not only do these iconic characters not contribute to the story in any meaningful way, but they actually detract from the originals and create plot holes when you try to connect the two. Why didn't Obi-Wan recognize C-3PO or R2-D2 when he saw them again decades later? Well, originally, it was because he never knew them before that point, but then the prequels came along to retcon that, just so that both of these cherished characters could be in them, because Lucas knew that's what the fans want. These fan-servicey narrative decisions are abundant and keep the prequels from existing as their own self-contained story within a larger universe. They're too busy drawing attention to the fact that they are prequels to a series of films that you, the audience, are familiar with. And if a viewer isn't familiar with Star Wars and is jumping in for the first time, it makes it a lot harder for them to enjoy the story on its own.
Conversely, Better Call Saul is all the stronger because it avoids this temptation almost entirely, with some exceptions. Even the writers of this show can't help but call back to Breaking Bad every now and again, which goes to show you just how tempting it can be. There have been even one or two instances where the callbacks get a little too obvious and risk breaking the immersion, but these moments are so few and far between that it can be forgiven. In addition, to further illustrate how easy it is to slide into the comfortable couch that is fan service, an interview with Vince Gilligan by Entertainment Weekly reveals that Gilligan was flirting with the idea of forcing a cameo appearance by a fan favorite character from Breaking Bad that would only detract from the scene's power and weight. This highlights a certain restraint and discipline to not cave into the same lazy pandering that Lucas is guilty of.
For the most part though, Better Call Saul focuses on telling its own story with a combination of familiar and original characters. While characters like Jimmy, Mike, Tuco, Hector, and Gustavo are all carryovers from Breaking Bad, they don't exist as mere callbacks, but as characters that serve to tell an all-new story. Moreover, these characters get a new lease on life as characters such as Mike, Gus, and even Hector are expanded upon. Hector's and Gus's relationship is expanded upon here and are both shown to be sympathetic in some respects, as their blood feud reaches its boiling point. In other words, attention isn't drawn to the fact that these characters are from Breaking Bad. Additionally, Better Call Saul adds a whole host of interesting and complex characters to the fray, such as Kim, Chuck, and Nacho. They are all memorable in their own right as Kim struggles with her own righteous morality and her sinful impulses, instigated by her boyfriend's love of the cornfield hunt. Chuck, of course, grapples with his own arrogance and sense of pride, as well as his externalized guilt in the form of his mental sickness that has subconscious connotations of how he treats his younger brother. And Nacho feels the pressure as his criminal upbringing starts to clash with his love and loyalty for his family. To cut a long story short, you don't have to have seen a second of Breaking Bad to get invested in characters such as Jimmy or Mike, because they are central characters of a new story that exists not to lead up to its predecessor, but to complement and supplement it. Of course, being familiar with Breaking Bad greatly enhances your investment in these characters, but it's certainly not necessary.
So while the Star Wars prequels are obsessed with calling attention to the older films with countless callbacks that beg you to have seen them to understand much of what is going on, Better Call Saul doesn't assume you've seen Breaking Bad. It doesn't indulge in the sinful pursuit of the past, and even goes as far as to provide an outlook of Jimmy's world in the future. Star Wars is stuck in the past, while Better Call Saul is soaring towards the future.
I think that while watching Better Call Saul, it becomes clear very quickly that it's not just a prequel to Breaking Bad, that it is its own distinct story that the writers genuinely wanted to tell. Not only does the show have a completely new cast of characters, setting, plot with a complementary lighter tone than Breaking Bad, but it is also clearly Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould's vision, a vision to tell the story of Jimmy McGill. Better Call Saul is not Breaking Bad version 2, it has its own themes and ideas that are explored through a set of flawed and morally ambiguous characters. It's not repeating the same story that's already been told.
The perfect example of a prequel on the opposite end of the spectrum is 2011's The Thing. Besides the final scene that sets up John Carpenter's 1982 classic, you might mistake the 2011 version to be a remake. That's because besides a few minor alterations to the plot, it plays out exactly the same as the original with none of the magic. For instance, a version of the blood test scene from the original is replicated here, but there's not nearly as much tension or suspense in these revised proceedings because it fails to build atmosphere through a lackluster score and a lack of attention in the cinematography that fails to provide a real sense of place.
Yeah, everything happens so quickly in the 2011 version, which means the audience never gets any real time to really sink their teeth into this isolated hellhole at the end of the world. The first scene where the Thin takes its first victim is one such example. The original showcases the horror and alien nature of the Thin, while the 2011 version plays it like an action scene.
In other words, it tries to be the original, but doesn't actually understand what made the original so effective in the first place.
Exactly, and as a result it's just a cash grab, because it offers nothing new. It's the Thin version 2. There's no real vision to create a new story with the original monster, with perhaps an evolution of the suspense and paranoia that made the original film so special. So while Better Call Saul is a new story with its own agency, the Thin 2011 is the same story with no such agency.
While Better Call Saul hasn't finished as of yet, it's safe to say that it manages to introduce plot points to set up the world we know in Breaking Bad in an organic fashion. Following both Jimmy's and Mike's journeys allows us to see not only a lot of characters pre-Breaking Bad, but to see these characters meeting for the first time. Mike meeting Gus makes sense, Jimmy meeting Mike makes sense, and Gus and Hector on screen together makes sense because the observable history of Breaking Bad had already defined these characters. It doesn't introduce plot points in a forced or nonsensical way to tie up everything that Breaking Bad introduced. Instead, it weaves Breaking Bad's legacy through its already developed and self-contained story.
I think a prequel that doesn't understand this is the Hobbit trilogy, which constantly has to remind the audience that it is a prequel by shoving in several different plot points that explicitly tie it to the Lord of the Rings. This result turns a simple children's story into a bloated mess.
Yes, this immediately brings to mind Gandalf's side plot, which allows Sauron to make a cameo. This is especially egregious as it adds nothing to the story besides setting up Sauron as the big bad and by extension the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Subplots are extremely important in that they need to complement, contradict, and or resonate with the film's underlying ideas. But Gandalf's plot in The Hobbit achieves none of this. It serves no purpose other than to please fans by having all these fan favorite characters in a scene together. I know a lot of what Peter Jackson added to The Hobbit comes from Tolkien's other works, but it still detracts from the pace of the story and takes focus away from Bilbo Baggins, whom the story is named after.
Scenes like this attempt to tie everything up in a little bow, but in doing so leave nothing to the audience's imaginations. Another instance of this is how the end of the Battle of the Five Armies feels the need to set up Legolas's meeting with Aragorn. It's another clunky setup for the Lord of the Rings and is telling of the Hobbit's surface level subject matter. Consequently, The Hobbit is needless, while Better Call Saul is essential.
Overall, Better Call Saul is a model example of how a creator should undertake the careful process of crafting a prequel film or series that stands on its own. To this end, Better Call Saul largely manages to avoid the trappings of the pointless nostalgia of fan service, and through further exploration of Breaking Bad's themes and ideas, it advances our understanding. It's not a simple retelling, and it doesn't detract from what came before, and it certainly doesn't indulge in nonsensical setup.
Exactly. Ultimately, it doesn't draw its power from its parent property like so many others. It looks outward instead of inward, effectively moving the series forwards, not backwards. That is why so many other prequels fall flat. They try to replicate their predecessor instead of succeeding it.
I'd like to thank Omega Reviews for collaborating on this video with me. If you enjoyed this or any of my other videos, do yourself a favor and check out his channel. It is criminally underrated and he makes great film analysis videos. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my subscribers. I just crossed 3,000, which is pretty awesome, and it's all because of you guys, so in all sincerity, thank you.